So without further ado, I want to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your participation. And I'd like to introduce Jonathan Howe. Jonathan.
Thank you, Diane, very much, and welcome everyone at this time of semi-crisis, real crisis. Diane used the term the new norm. I'd sort of like to get away from the concept of the new norm. And we're not going to have a norm, even new or otherwise. We're going to have as a new reality as to how we're doing business, the people we're doing business with, their needs, their concerns, their fears. I started the last program we did with you, Diane, with a little overview of the history. In the 1990s, we had an economic crisis, and the hotel industry was up in arms as to whether they would survive. And Daryl Hartley Leonard of Hyatt Hotels had a great line. He said, "We need to survive to 95." Then we did survive to 95 through 95. We ended up with 9/11. And at that point, we had something very different. We had not only the economic impact of what happened, but we also had the emotional, the fear aspect. So we had economy and fear and emotion all wrapped up into decisions being made. Then, as you may recall, after 9/11, but we had after 9/11, then we had a period where we had the Zika problem, we had the Ebola, we had swine flu. So people were very concerned about their health. So that had an impact on the meetings industry and the convention industry. Then along came good old COVID-19. And now we have the perfect storm. We have the emotional, the fear factor, we have the health factor, and we have the economic factor. Now today we're addressing the needs and wants of the independent planner segment and small business owner. You're probably more dramatically impacted than a whole lot of other people because your survival is probably somewhat in doubt and question. Trina will address a very important factor as to helping you with some of the economic issues that you may be facing. But let me talk to you about a few things that are going on today that have impact. We have basically 2 or 3 different approaches that are being taken by organizations and what they're doing. They're canceling their programs outright to the extent that they can get the cooperation, or they truly have a force majeure clause that would allow them to cancel without liability. Then we have the attempt to cancel but conditioned upon a new program, a postponement, a program at a later date. And the impact that that has on independent planners we'll address in just a second. And then we have sort of the problem with the total pushback of no movement on either side, or certainly on the side of the vendor. And those have posed a lot of difficulties as we're going forward. So we have seen now some reactions in the industry. We've seen it being pushed out further and further as to what they will allow you to cancel, what they will look at, what the quid pro quo might be for you to have that opportunity. One of the key elements too that we're looking at, especially now, is there are a lot of organizations that have made deposits, and the need to have those deposits returned is really tantamount to protecting the financial interests of not only the individual organization, but to everybody who's concerned along the way. We're getting pushback on the deposits. We're also finding, however, that I have a great concern, as do many people, as to maybe you push the program out, but will that hotel, will that venue be there at the time it's necessary for them to prepare to perform based upon the postponement? That's a difficulty because a lot of these hotels are now closed. Will they ever reopen? We don't know. And we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. So a lot of times we're getting that request for deposit and being returned, hotel blocks. One thing you may want to consider in protecting yourself is reaching an agreement on placing that deposit into an escrow or having that deposit otherwise protected so that your money is secure regardless of what the financial condition may be of the venue at a later date. We need to protect the financial aspect here too. Another thing that we are looking at is the issues of the hotel saying, well, we want you to come, it's going to lighten up and so on. One concern I have here is, well, if that is what the hotel's proposition is, you might want to make them put their money where their mouth is. In other words, will they be prepared to give you an assurance that all the restaurants will be open, that they'll have a full staff complement there to handle the needs of your particular program or event? So the real element then is we really need to have assurances on both sides. One thing too to remember with force majeure is that the hotel can also, or the vendor can also invoke force majeure to excuse their performance and get out without any liability to the other side. So it works both ways, and we have to bear that in mind. And there will be some hotels, I am sure, and other venue and vendors who are going to be saying, hey, I am going to cancel this program because of force majeure. And there are a lot of hotels now that are closed. Another difficulty we're having is in just trying to negotiate and figure out what we're going to do in the future. The people we've been negotiating with before are now on furlough. They're no longer there. So who do we talk to? How do we make this happen? That becomes another important task as we go forward. Well, I mentioned, what about the independent planner? You're sitting there, you've made an arrangement, you're working with your client to postpone or otherwise get them out of a predicament that they don't think their program will be successful because of the way things are right now. How do you protect yourself? Do you have a provision in your agreement with your client that should something like this happen and you have to do extra work, you will receive compensation for the work that you're about to perform, which is totally far and above what you had originally agreed to do? That's becoming problematic and becoming an issue as we go forward, and getting the understanding of your client as to the impact that this whole thing is having on your business and the people who you work with and the people who work with you and for you. Overall, we are living in a great uncertain time as to what is going to transpire. Every morning when I get up, I look at the news and there's something new and something different and something of concern and something of hope as we work our way through. But after this is all over, after we get rid of some of the sequestration and the stay-at-home requirements, are people going to be prepared to get out of the house? Are they going to be prepared to get on an airplane to go to an area that might still have a problem, or at least perceived of having a problem? Overall, we're in a difficult time. The best thing we can do is to continue our communication with those who rely on us and with those we rely on as well. And I think the key element right now is we've got to be patient, we've got to be understanding, we've got to be realistic. And that, I think, is one of the most important aspects. Your force majeure clause today probably will not be accepted tomorrow by the property. So what are the new clauses going to look like? We're going to have to wait and see and go through the negotiation process. But everybody's going to be gun shy. As I've said, the reason contracts have gotten so long over the last several years is contracts are based upon bad experiences. And certainly coronavirus is a bad experience, but it is universal. There's no one on this planet that is not in some way directly or indirectly impacted by what's happening out there. So Dianne, I know we've got questions that have come in, and I'd like to sort of take the time that's remaining here to address what you have on your mind, and see if we can try to resolve some of these issues overall, or at least provide some input or overview. But remember that this is free legal advice, and it may not be worth what you pay for it. And also, it should not be taken as directive as one way or the other. That you have to rely upon and should consult with legal counsel or your advisors as to how you should approach a particular situation. And also with this endemic aspect that we have, every contract is different. Every event is different. The demographics, the needs, the responses are all going to be different. So there's not one template that fits all. That's important to remember. Just because somebody else has been able to do something doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to do it as well. But we're looking at a whole lot of different dynamics, whether it be geophysical, whether it be the personalities, whether it be the age group of your organization. All of those are going to be different. One thing too that I think we can rest assured is that 2019 was a great year, and we made a lot of plans for 2020 based upon the economy and what we were looking at our business model as being in 2020 or in 2019 or 2020. It's not going to be the same in 2021. So you need to adjust and challenge yourself as to the needs and the requirements and the possible adjustments you're going to need to make in the plans as you go forward. So Dianne, what do we got?
No, John, I was taking notes while you were talking, but also looking at the questions that are coming in, because one question, just to your point, is regarding contracts from so the question is, do you foresee contracts being more, they're specialized. As contracts become more specialized, what is your advice for the independent planner in terms of protecting herself? And I think you kind of touched on it, but is there any other comment you have for that?
Sure. I think as the independent planner, you have a lot of issues at hand right now. You have the relationship that you have with your client. You have the relationship with your vendors, the relationship you have with those who work for you. All three of these publics have different needs and different protections. The key element here is, what are you doing as an independent to protect your own business model, and to do so in a way that it's not offensive, not looked upon as being greedy perhaps with the people you're doing business with. How are you going to approach it in the new era of new reality that we're dealing with? My concern is that the contracts that you probably have today as your templates need to be looked at, need to be reviewed and revised to deal with it accordingly. One of the things that I just mentioned was, how are you going to be compensated in the future relative to things like this? Many of you may be working strictly on a commission basis. Well, that commission basis isn't going to fly if the meeting doesn't get hold. So how do you protect yourself as to the time, the effort, and the rest that you put into it, and giving your soul and heart to the individual client and working with your people overall? The key element is we're going to have to take a hard look.
A hard look. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just going to keep shooting them at you, John. What penalty would you ask for if they, I suppose the client, don't meet the assurance clause? What is there a penalty? How can the independent planner, small business owner, protect themselves against, or protect themselves against a client with the client?
One of the problems we have is the contract you have today, which was made yesterday, is not going to necessarily work for tomorrow. And so you've got to live with the contracts you have today with the client. Now, with a lot of independents that we work with, they have been successful in explaining the situation to their customer, to their client, as to what they are facing and the need for them to be able to survive, to take care of that client in the future. And we're finding that there's a lot of understanding. But as I mentioned previously, and I've been a preacher of this for years, there is no such thing as win-win. What we want is a partnership, and with that partnership, we have a basic concept that we understand. That understanding is that in partnerships, we share in risk and we share in reward. Right now, we're sharing in a lot more risk than we are in reward. And so we need to evaluate that and look at our contracts with clients. Now, one of the problems has been over the years, a lot of the independents don't really have an agreement with their customer. They don't have an agreement with their client as to what happens in a situation like this. They've relied on a clause in the hotel contract that for sourcing that business to the hotel, they're going to get a commission. Previously 10%, now 7%, perhaps tomorrow no percent. But the key element is, if that meeting or that event doesn't get held, there's no commission and there's no way that you're going to get compensation. So the key element is, hopefully you learn a lesson as to the need to have a good, solid agreement with your client, as well as a good, solid agreement with your vendor on behalf of your client. That's the key that we need to look at today.
Yeah, and it's interesting, John, because obviously it's not that long ago that that independent planners weren't the force that they are today, and I see that as more and more growing, right? With all of the changes in workforce now, that there might even be a broader base of independent planning representation, right?
Yeah, as many of you know, I represent Meeting Professionals International, and they have a new segment of which I'm a co-chair. It's called the Independent Business Person, and they have this whole operation and program going. Take a look, the independent and small business owner segment at the MPI website, if you're a member of MPI, and if not, take a look at it anyway. Right. The key element is, this is the largest growing segment of the industry today, and no small part. The way it came about was with corporations and large organizations basically eliminating their meetings department putting those people out, and the first client they would have would then be, as an independent, would be their former organization that they worked for. So we have a huge segment of independent and small business owners who are in this industry, and they're learning the lesson, they're developing the technique, and that's why a program like this is so important, to protect those interests of this very large segment of the industry. And
Right.
I might add also, it's a very important segment that when we get done with this whole thing, this segment is going to be looked to by the vendor side of the aisle as to helping them get themselves back on their feet. So there should be a mutual admiration opportunity here, as well as for the event planner to being able to put this together, make it work for all sides, and recognizing the partnership aspect.
Right, and we're going to hear more from David Bruce, who founded the Alliance for Independent Meeting Planners in a little while. John, with the force majeures changing, and I don't know, this is a general question, but where can the independent planner go for the new force majeure? Is that a case by case like you've been talking about, or do you see it with all of your legal associates that there will be one place or a source? This is going to be different for everyone. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I'll make the comment here. It's going to be different for everyone overall, because depending on what your business model is. But I think an element here, if I may, one of my big concerns has been, and I preach about this as well, force majeure clauses have been basically, pardon the French, been bastardized. We have a lot of things we throw into a force majeure clause that really doesn't belong there. Remember, the premise of force majeure is it makes performance impossible or illegal. But we've now cluttered it up with a whole lot of other things. What I suggest is that if you have, for example, let's say you have a situation that is contingent upon something happening or not happening. For example, if you're doing a co-hosted program with another event, if that event doesn't occur, your whole purpose, for purposes of holding the meeting and holding those reservations, is defeated. So we want to have a clause in your contract if there is some contingency that's key, such as an example, let's say you want to have Mrs. Obama speak, and that she's the whole core of why you're going to have the program, but she suddenly is not available. You definitely want to have in your contract a provision that if she becomes unavailable for whatever reason, you have the right to cancel without liability, or to renegotiate the terms and conditions of the agreement. That's going to be dependent upon each event, what you're trying to achieve, what it is that you want to occur. And if that's a contingency, then it should be put into the contract, but not putting it into the force majeure clause. Put it as a separate standalone aspect of the contract. For example, you're doing a trade show, it may be necessary for you to have the convention center. Well, if that convention center isn't available, you're not going to have a trade show. So shouldn't that be part and parcel of the reason why you can cancel without liability the unavailability of the convention center? Or you might have in the convention center contract and other contracts that if you can't get 800 hotel rooms within a certain block area of the convention center, you're going to cancel or have the ability to cancel. So each one of these events, as I say, has got to be looked upon as being a separate individual identity, and how that plays relative to the entire aspect of what you're trying to accomplish.
Right. You know, in our program on the 23rd, we had a hotel panel. We had the 3 KSL, Rosewood, and Hard Rock. And some of the questions, I mean, the one thing that came up in their session was the importance of relationships. I mean, I have a question here, John. If a client decides to cancel their event in July, do you recommend we hold off officially canceling with venues to see if the force majeure applies? I understand some people who canceled May events before government lockdown took effect were still charged their cancellation. So
yeah, that is the what if question that we deal with every day.
You know,
what I say to clients is, you need to sit down, look at all the obligations that you have. You need to look at what is the last date that you have realistically, that if things are not in place by that date, you have to pull the trigger.
Right.
Now, one of the things here too is to consider that you're making a decision upon what it is as of the date that you pull the trigger to cancel. I think that's important. We're into the question of July. Hyatt Hotels, for the independent traveler, FIT and business traveler, has provided that through June 30, you can cancel, you can get your deposits back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They haven't extended that, to our knowledge, into the group business. We've been talking with several as to will we extend it. I think that's a pretty darn good argument to allow you to get through the end of June and cancel out without liability, and force majeure or otherwise. It's a good business decision looking at your program. As I said, your plan for, let's say, everything is hunky-dory come July 1 and everything ends on June 30, how many people are going to leap on an airplane July 5 to go someplace for a meeting? How many of those properties are going to have the personnel back that they need to fully staff when they've been told that they can't have a gathering of more than 5 or 10 people? It's going to be a lot of categorism of what's best at the time, looking at it, making decisions on the best information that you have. Yes, we try to postpone that, pulling the trigger on the force majeure as far as we can, but once in a while, it might be desirable to go a couple more weeks just from using the force majeure argument. But from a pragmatic, practical aspect, it makes no sense whatsoever. Let a little pragmatism, a little common sense overtake what the legal is in this particular situation, because it's going to work for both sides.
Yeah, and you know, John, like you said, this is you gave a disclaimer with what you're sharing with us, because, for example, we have another common question. If a hotel receives cancellation damages, shouldn't the third party still receive commission? We can't.
Well, that's a good question. I'll tell you, we see in a lot of hotel contracts, it's very specific that it is not commissionable on attrition payments or on cancellation payment. It's not commissionable. So you got to go back to what the contract with the property says as to how they deal with commission. And you got to read more than just that one little paragraph. You got to go through the entire contract. A lot of times what we're finding is you have somebody comes in and is fat and happy and says, oh my gosh, I got all this and that. Look at paragraph 3. Well, what they're missing is paragraph 15, which may have the limitation on what the liability is and what happens in the event of certain things happening. So every contract, as I say, is unique. Every contract is different. Every contract has different language. Sure, we'll see some patterns, but that doesn't mean the hotel contract you signed last week, or let's say last year, is going to be the same as the hotel contract you're signing today. It isn't going to be.
It's not going to be. Right. So these thoughts are, and again, how can independents change their contracts? Are there 1 or 2 examples you can give moving forward? What might be included in those, in the new contract?
I think that's a better question than saying what's a template. A better question would be, what are the checklist requirements that you need to have? Well, checklist is what's the nature of the engagement? What are the trigger points for you to be compensated? What about deposits that are made? What about deposits you make which are not refundable? How are those going to be dealt with by the other side, by your client and by the vendor with whom you're doing business?
Right.
It's again going to be what's important overall to protect your interests, and obviously, while you're not a fiduciary necessarily, what's going to be in the best interest of your client. Where this becomes complicated is that who is your client? You know, if you're being compensated by getting commission from the hotel, is the hotel your client, or is it the customer who you're getting that space for, the client? Lots of divided loyalties here, and how we deal with them is a very key factor. It has been a key factor for a lot of years, and just how we deal with it. Generally, what you're going to say to yourself as an independent, my client is the customer of the hotel, so I'm getting paid by the hotel maybe. That model, as we'll see, as I'm sure will address.
It's really a case by case. You know,
absolutely.
When you think about this, you can't. There's no one size fits all at all. I mean, and the thing is too is, John, here's a question. Like, you know, I mean, do you think that COVID, right, is a qualifying event in canceling hotel contracts? But what about the states where the governors haven't put the lockdown on or restricted
Again, Diane,
You know,
you're right back. Yeah, you're right back again as to what the situation is at the.
right.
Yeah, you may have a state that is still doesn't have a total um, stay-at-home requirement, but you may have a municipality that has a stay-at-home requirement.
Right.
So you got to drill down all the way through into this aspect of what's there. Then the other thing is from the standpoint of your client, they may have a whole lot of people who are going to say, nice boss, but I'm not going. How do you handle that? Now, in the corporate situation, it might be a little bit different. You don't follow what the boss tells you. You make a career adjustment. On the association side, the association member, no compulsion for them to show up, or much less bring the 10 people they said they were going to bring. They might just bring one or two. So we've got all these factors. Every one of these deals has got to be judged on its own individual merit, its own individual requirements. And the contingencies that we were talking about before all come into play. It is so important. Sit down, evaluate. Don't become a Pollyanna, and don't become a person that's, oh, woe is me either.
Right.
We can try to find some middle ground, work with it in the sharing of the risk. Everybody's sharing risk right now.
Everybody is, yes. And, the one comment from one of the attendees is that her event was scheduled for July 22 to 26 this year. It's a biennial convention. Unable to postpone, cancellation is my only option. I remember that exact topic coming up again in the hotel discussion that we had on the 23rd. And again, it went back to, if cancellation is the only option, then that's
the only option.
That's the only option, because I will speak on behalf of the 3 hoteliers that were on the panel, and they all said they're working as hard as they can with people to reformat, to repattern, to reconsider what options lie ahead of us, because again, we're dealing with such unprecedented times. But we don't know, again, John, we don't know the situation, do we?
No. I'll give you, move it a little bit. An incentive program was set for a particular place in May. The hotel wanted to postpone it into December, which was sort of a shoulder period for the hotel. But it certainly didn't work for this group, because that was a very busy time for the people who would be on the incentive, and they would not be able to go. So you've got to evaluate not only the question of postponement, is it a realistic postponement and a realistic aspect? If you have a trade show that's in February and you canceled it, and the hotel offers you, and the venue and the convention said, well, why don't you come back in November? Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to cannibalize your show for February of 2021 because you have this show so late in the year? Those are all things we got to consider. Look at Major League Baseball right now is worried about how they're going to get their season in. There's speculation that they move every game to Phoenix and then have something that would talk about binge watching, but you have a triple header.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's funny. Well, it's not funny, but one of the comments I had, I was on the phone this morning with one of the CEOs from the EIC. He said, Diane, our biggest concern right now is being able to keep up with all the meetings that were rescheduled into the, that short time frame, that July, August, September, because the reality is we don't know if this is going to come back for a rebound, this COVID-19. We don't know if it's going to come back, and I'm certainly not the expert on it, but it is something that our industry is obviously going to keep a track of, because it's going to affect all of us. But if that were the case, John, where someone reschedules for September, October, November, and then this comes back, like, what advice can you give them now to protect themselves?
Well, I hate to say this. I hate to say this, but what are your force majeure clauses, and what are the clauses in the contract? Are you amending the current contract, or are you entering into a new contract? If you're entering into a new contract, you definitely have to protect yourself. There's one major brand hotel that has their proposed force majeure clause. My advice to the clients relative to it as it currently stands is don't sign it. It's worthless from the standpoint of where you are. I was on the phone on Saturday with a association client of mine who is a very meetings intensive client. They have, and in the process right now, beginning basically with May 1 through the end of July, they're in the process of canceling over 173 meetings.
Oh, boy.
You want to talk about a logistical nightmare, that's it. And how they work overall to adjust, meet the needs. Each one of the groups that they have, the type of meetings they are all unique. And so all 173 of those have got to be evaluated in its own way, what the impact is, the impact upon the people who would be attending it and the like. This is a logistical nightmare. It's 24/7, and most groups right now are working 24/7 just at looking if they have that kind of meeting intensity.
Right. It's interesting. I'm actually I'm going to mention this comment to you, but I think it's a good one for David. Also, David, to take note of, we'll speak later on, is large corporations with whom we have MSAs sometimes refuse to sign a small business's own a service contract. So, you know, that's, again, that goes back, John, to what you said, is times are changing. This sector of the business is growing, and what is your advice for the
Well,
person?
we have several large corporate clients who rely upon third parties and small businesses overall, and they have their own contract and agreement that they use, but happily they are willing to make adjustments as may be needed. But they have certain things in that contract which they're not going to change, and I think that's what you have to find out first: is what are the things which are inviolate that I gotta take if I want the piece of business. And there are a lot of small business owners, obviously, that will look at it and bite their gums and clench their teeth and say, I need the business, so I'll sign it, even though I may have a little bit of higher degree of risk. That's a calculated business decision. I think from the standpoint of the small business owner, once in a while, Nancy Reagan might be right. Just say no. Some pieces of business.
You know, and maybe you're right. Just say no. Exactly. Right. I mean, and I think that again is going back to the power of the associations. John, I'm going to push you for a couple more questions here before our time runs out. Can you provide additional detail on requesting advanced hotel deposits to be placed in an escrow account? I'm negotiating a contract for late Feb 2021. And how can I be assured that the hotel will be in a stable financial status in 2021?
Well, you can't be assured that they'll be in good financial condition. You can by setting up an escrow. And there's a company out there called Meeting Escrow, which does a good job of interfacing between the property and the organization of placing the deposit into an escrow, dependent upon how the outcome is and what the conditions are. If performance takes place, the money goes to the vendor. If performance doesn't take place, the money goes back to the organization. So I think that the escrow issue right now is going to become more prevalent, especially when we don't know what that financial. If you've got a hotel that's now closed and says we want you to postpone it until next year, what assurance are you going to have they're there? And they want to hold on to your money that sort of tied them over to the next step. You're putting that money at a high degree of risk, and I think you have the right overall, or I should insist on getting the money either back or working with the hotel to provide some assurance to both sides that when time comes and push comes to shove, that money will still be there one way or the other.
Right, and that might actually go back to the whole relationship you have with each brand.
Absolutely.
And again, that's a whole nother segment we'll have to bring on again for an update in the next couple weeks to a month. Here, any recommendations on canceling a restaurant franchise conference scheduled for September 2020 through the force majeure clause due to the probability of 50% or more franchise locations having to permanently, I guess, cancel due to the pandemic?
Well, a lot of those franchisees are not going to be around. One of the things that goes, and I think maybe Trina will talk a little bit about this as to who's eligible for one of these care loans or payroll protection loans as to what. And one of the questions I saw on one of the forums the other day was, are you part of a franchise? Are you a franchise product? Whatever. Whether that's plus or a minus, I don't know. But a lot of the franchise operators now are just facing, they're out of business, and they have, you're a pizza parlor or whatever, you're in a whole different deal unless you're doing carryout, and you have a lot of places right now, even with doing carryout, just they have minimal staff there, in protection. I just think that you go evaluate realistically come September, number one, is that venue going to be open? And number two, and I think you can probably safely say that even if you go forward, you're not going to have the attendance you thought you were going to have based upon your 2019 evaluation that led you to have this program in 2020.
Right.
I think that it's just a good conversation. Now, one of the problems we talk about relationship business, part of the issue right now I have is you have a great relationship with George, but will George be there?
Is George there now?
Yeah, right? Exactly. And George probably's on furlough.
Yes. And so this is where, again, it's working with the professionals that have I guess, a bigger net of relationships, because again, here's a question that this is one of our last questions, is you just touched on the pros and cons of amending an existing contract versus getting a new contract. I mean, some of us just want to take contracts, I'm sure, say, throw it out the window. It's null, it doesn't apply anymore, but we can't. So
you can't, or you may not want to.
Right.
You may not want to. I mean, this is, again, I hate to say this again, but I will. It all depends on what's in your current agreement, what's in your best interest, and how you go about it. Yeah. And Dianne, if I don't mean this as an ad or anything else, but I mean, anybody wants to drop me an email, please feel free to do so.
You're going to be sorry you said that.
Well, I always am.
Well, listen, you know what?
I can't answer them all, but I try to do my best.
I know, John. And you and so many other of our in the legal profession, in the industry, have been so forthcoming with helping people, because again, it's overwhelming, it's unprecedented. There are so many questions that are unanswered, even on a case-by-case basis, because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. But I think what you're bringing out here is the value of just keeping informed, asking smart questions, and building the foundation so that when this does pivot, we have new tools to work with moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's right, Diane. I think the other thing too is that we need to remember we're all in this together. And we all have our own personal needs, our clients' needs, our feelings towards others. We need to be able to get through this thing, but recognize, as I said at the get-go, this is not the new norm, this is the new reality. And that reality is taking a very different form than we've ever seen before in any type of similar situation.
Yes, and I'm sure, again, David, I'm going to make this note to you, is whether through whatever association you're a member of or not, alliance, that you'll be addressing the urgency of advising members as to new contracts, new force majeure, new wording, there's a plethora of information that needs to be relayed to people. John, just as we wrap up, is there any comment or any thought you'd like to leave us with before we sign off?
Well, if you're standing by yourself and away more than 6 feet from anybody else, breathe in deeply, take a breath, relax. It may not be for a while that we're able to really, truly get back to where we'd like to be. But the thing is, stay well, fight the fight, and keep the faith. And as it said, we're all in this together.
Right. And I think the other thing that comes to mind in one of the comments is we're in a relationship business, but we are in a litigious business, and it's becoming more and more so over the years. Contracts used to be done with a handshake, no more. And so especially now with just one more thing added to them, we have to be astute, and we have to protect ourselves and our clients and our vendors in the process. So if there are no more questions, John,